In the late 18th century, a world ruled by kings and monarchs watched a radical experiment take shape. The concept of a president didn't exist. It was a completely blank slate. When George Washington took on this role, he faced a massive contradiction. He had to lead a brand new, vulnerable nation with enough strength to survive, without devolving into the exact type of tyranny they had just fought a war to escape. To prevent a dictatorship, Washington installed the foundational rules of the office. He voluntarily stepped away after 2 terms, establishing the tradition of a peaceful transfer of power. The presidency began as a fragile, untested framework, one that would be forced to adapt rapidly if the young republic was going to survive its first few decades. As the calendar flipped to the 19th century, the office shifted its focus from survival to expansion. The early leaders systematically pushed the physical borders of the country westward. Thomas Jefferson doubled the physical size of the United States with the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. Less than a decade later, James Madison had to defend that growing footprint by navigating the nation through the War of 1812. James Monroe then drew a line in the sand with the Monroe Doctrine, explicitly locking European powers out of the Americas. This set the stage for James K. Polk to conquer the Southwest, annexing Texas and Oregon and reaching from coast to coast. But this massive territorial land grab carried a flaw. While it brought vast wealth and resources, every new state added forced the country to answer whether that land would be free or enslaved, driving a wedge deep into the nation's foundation. Leaders like Franklin Pierce and James Buchanan failed to cool these rising tensions. Their inability to navigate the bitter divide over slavery led directly to Southern states seceding from the Union. Abraham Lincoln inherited this fractured country. He took office with a singular, monumental task: win the Civil War and preserve the Union. Along the way, he issued the Emancipation Proclamation, beginning the legal process of ending slavery. Lincoln achieved his victory, but his assassination passed the highly volatile era of Reconstruction to his successors. Andrew Johnson faced fierce clashes with Congress, becoming the first president to be impeached, while Ulysses S. Grant's administration struggled with widespread corruption scandals. The presidency survived its greatest existential threat, but the scars of the Civil War shifted the nation's trajectory, cementing federal authority over states' rights. As America transitioned into an industrial power, the Oval Office took on a new enemy: corporate monopolies. While Grover Cleveland fought systemic government corruption, Theodore Roosevelt broke up massive corporate trusts to protect consumers. The early 20th century swung between extremes. Woodrow Wilson projected American military might onto the global stage during World War I, and soon after, Calvin Coolidge oversaw a domestic economic explosion during the Roaring Twenties. But the prosperity evaporated. When the Great Depression hit, unemployment skyrocketed and breadlines stretched down city blocks. Herbert Hoover's inability to fix the sudden, devastating crisis came to define his entire term. The total economic collapse proved that managing the government was no longer enough. The public now expected the president to actively manage and rescue the American economy itself.
Franklin D. Roosevelt met that expectation by expanding executive power. He reshaped the economy with his sweeping New Deal programs and guided the nation through the grinding global conflict of World War II, winning a historic 4 terms in the process. Harry S. Truman made the fateful decision to deploy atomic bombs to end that war. By pushing that button, he introduced the atomic age, meaning the person sitting in the Oval Office now held the power to destroy the world. Dwight D. Eisenhower leveraged the post-war peace to build domestic prosperity, notably constructing the modern interstate highway system that connected the country like never before. Soon after, John F. Kennedy's vision for a new frontier was cut short by his assassination. Lyndon B. Johnson took up the mantle, pushing through landmark civil rights legislation to fight poverty and segregation, even as his administration deeply divided the public by escalating the Vietnam War. Richard Nixon opened historic relations with China and ended U.S. involvement in Vietnam. However, those diplomatic victories were eclipsed by the Watergate scandal, culminating in the first and only presidential resignation in American history. Ronald Reagan pivoted the country's finances again, pushing tax cuts and reduced regulations. On the world stage, he took an aggressive stance against the Soviet Union, famously demanding the removal of the Berlin Wall and helping bring the Cold War to a close. Heading into the year 2000, the American president acted as the central node of global geopolitical power, managing international crises with the same weight as domestic policy. This era began with deep contrasts. Bill Clinton presided over the longest peacetime economic boom in U.S. history and balanced the federal budget. But shortly after, George W. Bush shifted the nation onto a continuous war footing in Afghanistan and Iraq, following the September 11th attacks. Barack Obama made history as the first African-American president, focusing his power on domestic shifts like the Affordable Care Act and clean energy. Donald Trump then disrupted the political landscape with an America First agenda, tightening trade and sparking intense political divisions. Joe Biden was immediately tasked with steering the country through the COVID-19 pandemic and passing relief bills. That led right back into a historic moment in 2025, when Donald Trump secured a non-consecutive second term, characterized by heavy executive actions and renewed clashes over immigration. Today, the modern presidency is defined by intense polarization. It wields enormous unilateral power, heavily relying on executive orders to bypass a gridlocked Congress and respond to an era of continuous global crises. That empty desk from the 18th century is entirely buried today. It is burdened by 2 centuries of complex history, expansion, and global responsibility. The office has become a living reflection of America's own evolution. Every new territory gained, every civil right won, and every international crisis survived carries the distinct fingerprint of this position. Looking back across this timeline, you have to ask yourself, which individual leader left the most profound impact on the world we live in today? The evolution of this office mirrors the nation's own growth, an unfinished experiment in power that continues to adapt with every new administration.